The land held its breath that morning. Not the easy quiet of a Sunday dawn, but the stillness that comes when something has been decided, and the world waits to see what follows. The Oklahoma plains stretched flat and pale under a sky the color of old pewter, and the wind carried dust that tasted of iron and distance. It was April, but spring had not yet convinced the earth to soften. The grass stood brittle and yellow, and the few trees that broke the horizon line looked like the sketches of trees rather than the living thing. She had been walking since before light. Her name was Nora Garrett, though she had not heard it spoken aloud in 11 days, and she was beginning to forget the sound of her own voice. She was 42 years old. Not young, not old, not broken, but not whole either. She wore a coat too large for her frame. The sleeves rolled twice at the wrists, and her boots were good leather but worn thin at the heels. Her hair, once carefully pinned, now hung in a single braid down her back, streaked with gray she had stopped minding. She carried a canvas sack over one shoulder, and a canteen that sloshed half full when she walked. That was all. The road she followed was not much of a road. 2 ruts carved by wagon wheels, mostly grass between them, and here and there, the white shine of the stone pushed up by frost. It ran straight west, and she walked it because it was there, and because west was as good a direction as any when you had no destination. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her now but a burned house and a grave she had dug herself in ground still half frozen. She had planted no marker. The dead do not need reminding. She walked steadily, without haste. Her shadow stretched long to her left, thin and quiet. A hawk circled high above, its cry sharp and lonely. She watched it for a moment, then let her eyes drop back to the road. The sack on her shoulder held a wool blanket, a tin cup, a box of matches wrapped in oilcloth, a few strips of dried venison, and a small leather pouch she had not opened since the day she packed it. Inside the pouch was a ring. She did not wear it anymore. The sun climbed slow and pale. By mid-morning the dust had settled and the air grew warmer, though it still carried a chill in the shadows. She stopped once to drink from the canteen, 2 swallows only, and then kept on. The land rolled gently now. Long swells like the memory of an ancient sea. In the low places, there were clusters of scrub oak and dogwood not yet blooming. And once she passed a windmill standing motionless above a dry stock tank, its blades rusted into stillness. No cattle, no horses, no smoke from any chimney. She did not mind the emptiness. She had chosen it. By noon, she saw the town. It appeared first as a smudge on the horizon, a gathering of vertical lines that interrupted the flatness, and then slowly it took shape. A water tower, a church steeple, the dark blocks of buildings huddled along a single main street. She stopped and stood looking at it for a long time. She had not planned to stop. She had been going nowhere in particular, only away. But her feet were sore, and the canteen was nearly empty. And a town meant a well, at least, maybe a store. She could buy a little flour, a little salt. She still had $3 folded in the bottom of her boot. She walked on. The road widened and became more deliberate, the ruts deeper and lined with the dried prints of horses and wagon wheels. She passed a fence, then another, both sagging and strung with rusted wire. A cow skull lay white and clean beside a post. She did not look at it long. The town had a name, though she did not see it written anywhere as she entered. Later she would learn it was called Vardy, a name that had belonged to the man who owned the land office and the livery and most of the buildings on the main street. He was dead now, people said, but the name had stuck the way names do when no one cares enough to change them. The street was wide and unpaved, rutted deep in places where the rain had pooled and dried and pooled again. Buildings lined both sides, clapboard and false-fronted. Their paint long since scoured away by wind. A general store, a blacksmith with a cold forge, a saloon with no sign, only a door propped open and the smell of old beer drifting out. Across from it stood a squat stone building with bars on the windows, which she took for a jail, though there was no marshal's office that she could see. And in the center of the street, where the road widened into something like a square, there was a cage. She saw it and stopped walking. The cage was iron, man-tall and narrow, hardly wide enough for a person to sit. It stood on a wooden platform raised a foot off the ground, and inside it was a man. He sat with his back against the bars, his knees drawn up, his head tilted forward so his face was hidden. He wore no that. His shirt was torn at the shoulder and stained with something dark. His hands rested on his knees, and his fingers were long and still. There were people in the street. Not many, but enough. A woman in a faded blue dress stood outside the general store, a basket on her arm, watching. Two men sat on the steps of the saloon, one whittling a stick, the other smoking. A boy of perhaps 10 leaned against the water trough, staring at the cage with the blank curiosity of a child who has seen something ugly so many times it no longer surprises him. No one spoke. No one moved. Nora stood at the edge of the square and looked at the man in the cage, and something in her chest tightened and would not let go. She did not know him. She did not know what he had done or why he was there. But she knew the shape of a man who had been left to the mercy of a town that had none. She walked forward slowly. Her boots made small sounds in the dust. The boy by the trough turned to look at her, and the woman with the basket shifted her weight but did not leave. Nora stopped a few feet from the cage. The man inside did not move. She could see his breathing, shallow and slow. She could see the dirt on his hands and the shadow of a bruise along his jaw. She did not say anything. She unslung the canvas sack from her shoulder and reached inside. Her fingers found the tin cup and the canteen. She unscrewed the cap and poured water into the cup. Not much, just enough to cover the bottom. Then she stepped closer. The bars of the cage were spaced wide enough for a hand. She held the cup out between them. The man looked up. His eyes were gray, pale as creek stone, and they met hers without shame or plea. He did not reach for the cup. He only looked at her, and she looked back. And for a moment, the street and the watching people and the whole hard world fell away. Then he moved. Slowly, as if he had forgotten how, he lifted one hand and took the cup from her. His fingers brushed hers. They were cold. He drank, not quickly, 3 small sips, careful and deliberate, and then he handed the cup back through the bars. She took it. He lowered his hand. Neither of them spoke. Nora stepped back. She did not look at the woman or the men or the boy. She turned and walked toward the general store, her boots quiet in the dust, the sun warm now on the back of her neck. Behind her, the man in the cage sat very still, and in his hand, hidden against his knee, he held the dampness of the water she had given him, as if it were a promise. The general store smelled of coffee and lamp oil and the faint sweetness of dried apples in a barrel by the door. The light inside was dim, filtered through a single window hazed with dust, and it took a moment for Nora's eyes to adjust. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods and bolts of cloth and coils of rope, all of it orderly but worn. The kind of inventory that turned over slowly in a town where people bought only what they needed and nothing more. Behind the counter stood a man with a gray beard trimmed close and spectacles balanced on the bridge of his nose. He looked up when she entered, his gaze moving from her face to her coat to the canvas sack she carried, and then he nodded once, neither welcoming nor cold. She nodded back. She walked to the counter and set the sack down. Her hands were steady. She could still feel the coolness of the man's fingers where they had touched hers, but she did not think about it. She thought about flour and salt and how much $3 would buy. The man behind the counter waited. After a moment, he spoke. His voice was dry and even, the voice of someone who had long ago decided that words were tools to be used sparingly. "Help you with something?" "Flour," Nora said. £2 if you have it, and salt." He nodded and turned to the shelves behind him. She watched him measure the flour into a cloth sack, his movements precise, and then scoop salt into a smaller bag tied with string. He set both on the counter between them. "Anything else?" She hesitated. Then she said, "Water. Is there a well?" "Out back. Help yourself." She reached into her boot and pulled out the folded bills, damp from her skin and the long walk. She smoothed them on the counter. He took one and made change from a wooden box, counting coins into her palm without meeting her eyes. She slipped them into her coat pocket. "The man in the cage," she said. The storekeeper's hands stopped moving. He looked at her now, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharpened. She met his gaze and did not look away. "What about him? What did he do?" The storekeeper tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether the question deserved an answer. Then he leaned back against the shelf behind him and folded his arms. Came through 3 days ago. Didn't say where from. Didn't say where he was going. Kept to himself, mostly. Then Amos Farrell's barn caught fire. Nora waited. Farrell says he saw him near it that evening. Says he smelled of kerosene. Says he's the one set it. Did he? The storekeeper shrugged. Farrell says he did. That's enough for most folks. And the law? Marshal's 2 counties over. Sent word, but he won't come for a barn fire. Said to hold him till he could get here, or till Farrell decides what to do. Nora looked down at the flour and salt on the counter. She could feel the weight of the coins in her pocket, small and hard and cold. How long has he been in there? 3 days, like I said. Has anyone fed him? The storekeeper's mouth tightened. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. Farrell sends his boy with water once a day. Says a man who burns another man's barn doesn't deserve more than that. Nora picked up the flour and the salt and placed them carefully in her sack. Then she looked at the storekeeper again. I'd like to buy some biscuits, she said, and a piece of that bacon hanging behind you. He studied her for a long moment. Then he turned and took down the bacon, slicing a portion with a knife he kept under the counter. He wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with string. From a tin beside the register, he took 4 biscuits, hard and pale, and wrapped those as well. He set both parcels on the counter. That'll be another 30 cents. She paid him. He took the coins and dropped them into the box without counting them. When she picked up the parcels, he spoke again. His voice quieter now, almost careful. Folks around here don't take kindly to strangers who make trouble. And they don't take kindly to strangers who side with troublemakers. I'm not siding with anyone, Nora said. I'm feeding a man who's hungry. Same thing, way most people see it. She slung the sack over her shoulder and tucked the parcels under her arm. Then most people see it wrong. She walked to the door and pushed it open. The sunlight outside was bright and hard after the dimness of the store, and she squinted against it. Behind her the storekeeper said nothing more, but she could feel his eyes on her back as she stepped into the street. The square was emptier now. The woman with the basket was gone, and so were the men on the saloon steps. Only the boy remained, still leaning against the water trough, still watching the cage. When Nora walked toward it, he straightened and stared at her, his face pale and sharp beneath a shock of colorless hair. She stopped in front of the cage. The man inside had not moved. He sat as he had before, his back against the bars, his head tilted forward. But when her shadow fell across him, he looked up, and his gray eyes found hers again. She knelt and set the parcels on the ground. The paper crinkled faintly. She unwrapped the biscuits and held one through the bars. He stared at it for a moment, as if he did not trust what he was seeing. Then he reached out, slowly, and took it from her hand. His fingers were steadier now. He ate without hurry, breaking the biscuit into pieces and chewing each one carefully, as if he were trying to remember the taste of food. She unwrapped the bacon and tore off a strip and passed it through. He took that too. She watched him eat and said nothing. There was nothing to say. When he had finished, he looked at her. His lips moved, shaping a word she could not hear. And then he said it aloud, his voice rough and low and barely more than a whisper. Thank you. She nodded. She gathered the paper and the string and stood. The boy by the trough was watching her, his mouth half open, and beyond him in the shadow of the saloon, she saw a man's shape, motionless and silent. She did not look at either of them. She turned and walked toward the back of the general store, where the storekeeper had said the well was, and she did not look back. Behind her, the man in the cage sat with his hands resting on his knees, and in his chest, something that had been closed for a long time began, very slowly, to open. She found the well behind the store, a stone-lined circle with a wooden bucket and a rusted pulley that squeaked when she turned it. The water came up cold and clear, and she filled her canteen and drank deeply, letting the coolness settle in her chest. The sun was high now, and the air had warmed enough that she could unbutton her coat. She stood for a moment in the narrow shade of the building and listened to the silence. No voices, no footsteps, only the faint creak of a shutter somewhere down the street and the distant call of a crow. She did not want to stay in this town. She had not wanted to stop at all, but something had shifted when she gave the man water and then food. And now she could not simply walk away. She did not know why. She only knew that leaving felt wrong in a way she could not name. She walked back to the square. The cage stood where it had, stark and ugly in the center of the street, and the man sat inside it with his eyes closed and his head resting against the bars. She approached quietly. When she was close enough, she knelt again and set the canteen on the platform beside the cage. He opened his eyes. He looked at the canteen, then at her. She did not speak. She reached into her sack and took out the wool blanket, old and gray, but clean, and folded it twice. She pushed it through the bars. It caught on the iron and she had to angle it carefully, but it went through. He took it and held it in his lap, his hands smoothing the fabric as if he had forgotten what softness felt like. "Night gets cold," she said. He nodded. His voice came quiet and hoarse. "Why are you doing this?" She did not answer right away. She looked at him. At the bruise on his jaw and the torn shoulder of his shirt, and the way his hands trembled slightly, even as they stilled on the blanket. She thought of the grave she had dug, and the house she had burned, and the ring in the pouch she had not opened. "Because no one else is," she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then he looked down. She stood and turned and walked toward the edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the land opened again into prairie. She found a place in the lee of an abandoned shed, its roof half collapsed and its walls leaning, but still enough to break the wind. She spread her coat on the ground and sat with her back against the weathered wood. From here, she could see the square, the cage, the man inside it. She ate a biscuit and a strip of bacon and drank a little water, and then she waited. The afternoon passed slowly. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadows lengthened. And a few people came and went along the street, their faces turned deliberately away from the cage. Once a dog wandered close and sniffed at the platform, and the man inside watched it, but did not move. The dog lost interest and trotted away. As the light began to fail, a boy came, older than the one by the trough, perhaps 14, with a bucket in his hand. He walked to the cage and set the bucket down, just outside the bars, not close enough for the man to reach. He said something Nora could not hear, his voice flat and dutiful, and then he turned and walked away. The man in the cage stared at the bucket for a long time. Then he lay down on his side, the blanket pulled over his shoulders, and closed his eyes. Nora stayed where she was. The sky deepened to purple, and then to black, and stars appeared one by one, cold and distant. The air grew sharp. She pulled her coat around her and tucked her hands into her sleeves. She did not sleep. She sat and watched the cage, a darkish shape against the darkness, and thought about nothing and everything. Sometime near midnight she stood. Her legs were stiff and her back ached, but she moved quietly across the square. The town was silent, no lights in any window, no sound but the wind and the faint creak of the cage when the man inside shifted in his sleep. She knelt beside the platform and picked up the bucket the boy had left. It was still half full. She poured the water into her canteen, and then she reached through the bars and set the canteen where the man could find it when he woke. Beside it, she placed the last 2 biscuits, wrapped in the brown paper. She stood and looked down at him. He lay curled on his side, the blanket pulled tight, his breathing slow and even. His face in the starlight looked younger than she had thought, maybe 30, maybe less. She wondered what his name was. She wondered if he had set the fire or if Farrell had simply needed someone to blame. It did not matter. Blame was easy. Mercy was not. She walked back to the shed and sat again in the cold. She did not sleep. When the sky began to pale in the east, she heard him stir. She watched as he sat up slowly, his movements careful, and saw him find the canteen and the biscuits. He held them for a moment, turning them in his hands as if they were something precious. Then he drank and ate, and when he was finished, he looked toward the shed. She did not know if he could see her in the dim light, but she lifted one hand, just slightly, and after a moment, he lifted his in return. The sun rose. The town began to wake. A rooster crowed somewhere behind the buildings, and smoke rose from a chimney near the edge of the square. Nora stood and brushed the dust from her coat. She walked to the well and filled the canteen again. And then she walked to the general store. The door was still locked, but she sat on the step and waited. The storekeeper arrived as the sun cleared the horizon. He stopped when he saw her, his keys in his hand, and looked at her without surprise. "You're still here," he said. "I am." He unlocked the door and pushed it open. He did not invite her in, He did not tell her to leave either. She stood and followed him inside. He walked behind the counter and began to arrange things that did not need arranging. his movements deliberate and slow. "You planning to stay?" he asked. "For a while. Farrell won't like it. I don't need him to like it." The storekeeper nodded slowly. He took off his spectacles and queened them on his sleeve, then put them back on. "There's a room above the saloon. Widow Pratt rents it sometimes. $5 a week." Nora counted the coins in her pocket. She had enough. Barely. "I'll take it," she said. He wrote something on a scrap of paper and handed it to her. "Show that to Pratt. Tell her I sent you." She took the paper and folded it carefully. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Just don't make me regret it." She left the store and walked across the square. The man in the cage was awake now, sitting with his back against the bars, the blanket folded beside him. When he saw her, he stood, his hands gripping the iron. She stopped a few feet away. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, then he said, Caleb Stern." "I'm Nora." He nodded. They stood looking at each other, and in the growing light, she saw something in his face she had not seen before. Not hope, exactly, but not despair either. Something in between. Something fragile and new. "I'm staying," she said. He did not ask why. He only nodded again. And his hands loosened on the bars. The room above the saloon was small and spare, with an iron-framed bed, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, and a window that looked out over the main street. The glass was cracked in one corner, and the wind came through at night. But the roof did not leak, and the door had a latch that worked. Widow Pratt, a lean woman with steel-colored hair and a face that gave nothing away, took Nora's $5 without comment and handed her a key on a loop of twine. "No cooking up here," she said. "No visitors after dark. You break something, you pay for it." Nora nodded. She carried her canvas sack up the narrow stairs and set it on the bed. The mattress was thin, but clean. She stood at the window and looked down at the square. From here, she could see the cage clearly, and the man inside it. Caleb. She said the name quietly to herself, testing the shape of it. He was standing now, his hands resting on the bars, his face turned toward the horizon. She stayed in the room only long enough to splash water on her face from the basin on the chair. Then she went back downstairs and out into the street. The day was bright and cool, the sky a hard blue without clouds. She walked to the cage and stopped a few feet away. "Have you eaten?" she asked. Caleb shook his head. "The boy hasn't come yet." She looked toward the far end of the street, where a cluster of buildings marked the edge of town. One of them, the storekeeper had told her, belonged to Amos Farrell. She had not seen him yet, but she knew she would. Men like Farrell always made themselves known. "I'll bring you something," she said. "You don't have to." "I know." She walked back to the general store. The storekeeper was stacking cans on a shelf, and he glanced at her when she entered, but said nothing. She bought bread and a wedge of cheese and a jar of preserves, counting out her coins carefully. When she returned to the cage, Caleb was sitting again, his back against the bars. She tore the bread in half and spread it with preserves, then passed it through. He took it and ate slowly, his eyes on the ground. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "I mean, before the fire, in this part of the country." He swallowed and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. 2 years. "Maybe 3, I lose track." "Where did you come from?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "East, Pennsylvania originally, a long time ago." She heard something in his voice, a weight that had settled there and would not lift. She knew that weight. She carried her own. "What brought you west?" He looked up at her, his gray eyes steady. "Same thing that brings most people. Running from something, looking for something. I'm not sure which anymore." She nodded. She sat down on the edge of the platform, her back to the bars so they were close but not facing each other. It was easier that way. Easier to talk when you did not have to hold someone's gaze. "I had a farm," he said after a while. "Back in Pennsylvania. 40 acres. A house my father built. I was going to leave it to my son." The past tense sat heavy between them. Nora did not turn around. "Was," she said quietly. "Was." The wind picked up, stirring dust along the street. A shutter banged somewhere. Caleb shinted behind her, and she heard the faint clink of the bars. "Fever took him," he said. "He was 6. My wife, she lasted another year, but she wasn't really there anymore, not after we buried him. One morning I woke up and she was gone. Walked out into the snow in her nightdress. They found her 2 days later." Nora closed her eyes. She could see it, The small grave, the woman in white against the snow, the man left alone in a house full of ghosts. I sold the farm, Caleb continued. Took what I could carry and started walking. Thought maybe if I got far enough away I could leave it behind. But you can't, can you? Leave it behind. You just carry it with you in a different place. No, Nora said. You can't. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch. She had not opened it since the day she packed it, but now she loosened the string and tipped the contents into her palm. A ring. Plain gold, thin and worn. She held it up so the sunlight caught it. I was married too, she said. For 18 years, his name was Thomas. He was a good man, fair and steady. We had a house, not much, but it was ours. He built a porch where we'd sit in the evenings. He'd whittle and I'd shell peas or mend, and we didn't need to talk much. It was enough just to be there. Caleb said nothing, but she felt him listening. He got sick last winter. Started as a cough, then fever, then he couldn't breathe right. I did everything I knew. Kept him warm, made him drink willow bark tea, sat with him every night. It didn't matter. He died in February. I buried him behind the house. And then I burned it, the house. I couldn't stay there, couldn't sit on that porch alone. So I burned it and I left. She closed her hand around the ring. The metal was warm from her skin. I thought if I walked far enough, I'd find a place where it didn't hurt so much. But you're right. You just carry it with you. She opened her hand again and looked at the ring. Then she turned and passed it through the bars. Caleb took it, his fingers closing around it gently. Why are you giving me this? He asked. So you know you're not the only one carrying something. He held the ring for a long moment, turning it in his palm. Then he reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small wooden figure, no bigger than his thumb. It was a horse, carved with care, the legs and mane distinct despite the size. He passed it back through the bars. My son's, he said. I made it for him. It's the only thing I kept. Nora took the carving and held it carefully. The wood was smooth, worn by small hands. She could feel the love in it, the hours spent shaping it, the boy who had carried it. Thank you, she said. They sat in silence, the ring and the horse between them, two strangers bound by loss. The sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened, and the town moved around them, indifferent and small. But in that moment, on the edge of the platform with the bars between them, they were not alone. After a while, Nora stood. She handed the carving back through the bars, and Caleb returned the ring. She slipped it into the pouch and pulled the string tight. I'll come back this evening, she said. I'll be here, he said, and there was something almost like humor in his voice, faint and fragile. She walked back to the room above the saloon and lay down on the narrow bed. She did not sleep, but she rested, and for the first time in weeks. The weight she carried felt just a little bit lighter. Amos Farrell came to the square on the 4th day. Nora heard him before she saw him, his voice loud and certain, the kind of voice that expected to be heard and obeyed. She was sitting on the platform beside the cage, mending a tear in her coat with needle and thread she had bought from the storekeeper. Caleb sat on the other side of the bars, watching her hands move. Neither of them had been speaking. They had learned that silence between them was not empty, but full, a kind of conversation that needed no words. Farrell appeared at the far end of the street, walking with 2 other men flanking him like shadows. He was broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, his beard trimmed close and streaked with gray, his hat pulled low. He wore a leather vest over a clean shirt, and his boots were good, the kind that cost money. The men with him were younger, lean and hard-eyed, and they carried themselves like dogs waiting for a command. Nora set down her needle. Caleb's hands tightened on the bars. Farrell stopped a few feet from the cage. His eyes moved from Caleb to Nora and back again. When he spoke, his voice was even, almost friendly, but there was iron underneath. You're the woman been feeding him. It was not a question. Nora stood slowly, folding the coat over her arm. She met his gaze and did not look away. I am. Why? Because he's hungry. Farrell's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. He burned my barn, burned my tools, my hay, damn near killed my horses. You think a man like that deserves your charity? Peak a man in a cage deserves to eat. One of the younger men stepped forward, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, but Farrell raised a hand and the man stalked. Farrell tilted his head, studying Nora the way a man might study a horse he was thinking of buying. "You got a name?" "Nora Garrett." "Where you from, Nora Garrett?" "East of here." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I'm giving." Farrell nodded slowly. He turned his attention to Caleb, who had risen to his feet inside the cage. They looked at each other, and the air between them tightened like a rope pulled taut. "You got anything to say for yourself, Stern?" Caleb's voice was quiet but steady. "I didn't burn your barn." "That's not what I saw." "Then you saw wrong." Farrell's jaw worked. For a moment Nora thought he might spit, but he swallowed instead. "I saw you standing near it. I smelled kerosene on your coat. That's enough. I was walking past. I smelled smoke and went to see. By the time I got there, it was already burning. I tried to get your horses out. That's why I smelled like kerosene, because I was inside trying to save what I could. And I'm supposed to believe that? Believe what you want. It's the truth." Farrell stepped closer to the cage. His voice dropped, low and dangerous. "The marshal's not coming. You know that, don't you? He's got bigger problems 2 counties over, which means it's up to me to decide what happens to you. And I'm thinking maybe a cage is too good. Maybe what you need is a rope." Nora moved before she thought. She stepped between Farrell and the cage, her body a line drawn in the dust. Her voice came sharp and clear. "You touch him, you'll have to go through me first." Farrell stared at her. The 2 men behind him shifted, their hands moving to their belts, but Farrell did not move. He looked at Nora for a long time, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're doing, woman. I know exactly what I'm doing. You take his side, you make yourself his enemy, and mine. Then that's what I am." The silence stretched. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the square. Somewhere a door slammed. Farrell's hands curled into fists at his sides, and Nora thought he might reach for her, but he did not. Instead, he stepped back, his face dark. "You want to throw your lot in with a barn burner. That's your choice, but don't come crying when it costs you." He turned and walked away, his boots heavy in the dirt. The 2 men followed, glancing back once before disappearing around the corner of a building. Nora stood where she was, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. She did not sit down. She could not yet. Behind her, Caleb's voice came quiet. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. He'll come back, and next time he won't just talk." She turned to face him. His eyes were wide, gray as winter sky, and there was fear in them but also something else. Gratitude. Maybe more than that. "Let him come," she said. She sat back down on the platform and picked up her needle and thread. Her hands were steadier now. Caleb watched her for a moment, and then he sat too, his back against the bars. They did not speak. The sun climbed higher, and the day moved on, and the town watched from behind closed shutters and half-open doors. That night, Nora woke to the sound of breaking glass. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and looked toward the window. A rock lay on the floor, jagged and fist-sized, and the cracked pane was shattered now, the night air pouring through. She rose and walked to the window, careful of the glass, and looked down into the street. It was empty, dark, silent. She did not sleep again that night. She sat in the chair by the window, her coat wrapped around her shoulders, and watched the cage. Caleb was a shadow inside it, unmoving. She wondered if he was awake too, staring into the same darkness, carrying the same fear. When the sun rose, she went downstairs and found a broom. She swept the glass into a pile and carried it outside. Widow Pratt stood in the doorway of the saloon, her arms folded, her face unreadable. "You should leave," the widow said. "I'm not leaving." "Then you're a fool." Nora dumped the glass into a barrel behind the building and walked back inside. She washed her face and hands, then went to the general store. The storekeeper was sweeping the floor, and he looked up when she entered. His expression was careful, measured. "Heard Farrell paid you a visit?" "He did." "Heard you stood up to him." "I did." The storekeeper leaned on his broom. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That took courage, or stupidity. Hard to say which. Does it matter? I suppose not." He set the broom aside and walked to the counter. "You need something?" "Bread, and coffee, if you have it." He wrapped the bread and measured coffee into a small sack. "What?" And he handed it to her. He did not let go right away. She looked up at him. "Be careful," he said. "Farrell's not a patient man, and he's got friends." "So do I," she said, though she was not sure it was true. She paid him and left. When she reached the cage, Caleb was standing, his hands gripping the bars. He looked tired, his face drawn, but his eyes were steady. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine. I heard the glass. It was nothing." He shook his head slowly. "This isn't your fight." "Nora." "Yes," she said. "It is." She tore the bread and passed half through the bars. They ate together in silence, and when they were finished, she sat on the platform and he sat inside, and they waited for whatever was coming next. They came on the 5th night, 3 of them, moving through the dark like shadows with intent. Nora heard their boots on the hard-packed street, the low murmur of voices conferring, the scrape of something metal against wood. She was awake, sitting in the chair by the broken window, and when she heard them she stood and looked down into the square. They carried a length of rope and a wooden beam. One of them had a lantern, the light swinging as he walked. She recognized none of their faces in the dim glow, but she knew what they intended. She grabbed her coat and ran. Down the stairs, through the saloon door, into the street. Her boots pounded the dirt, and her breath came sharp in her chest. They heard her coming and turned, startled, the lantern lifting. She saw their faces then, young men, maybe 20, hard-faced and certain in the way of men who have been told what to do and believe it is right. "Get away from him," she said. The one holding the lantern stepped forward. "This isn't your concern, ma'am." "It is now. Farrell says he's had enough waiting. Says justice delayed is justice denied. We're here to finish it." Nora moved to stand between them and the cage. Behind her she heard Caleb rise, heard his hands grip the bars. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the men in front of her. "You do this, you're murderers, nothing more. He's a murderer, burned Farrell's barn, could have killed his family. He says he didn't do it. And you believe him?" "I do." The man with the lantern shook his head. "You're a fool then. Step aside." "No." They moved forward together, the 3 of them, and Nora felt the ground tilt beneath her. She was one woman, 42 years old, no weapon, no help, but she did not move. She stood with her feet planted and her hands loose at her sides, and she met their eyes one by one. "You want him, you go through me." For a moment no one moved. The lantern light flickered, casting wild shadows across the square. Then a voice came from the darkness to her left, low and steady. "And me." The storekeeper stepped into the light. He carried no gun, no weapon of any kind. But his presence was solid, immovable. He walked to stand beside Nora, his hands in his pockets, his face calm. "This isn't right," he said. "You know it isn't." The men hesitated. One of them shifted the rope in his hands. The one with the lantern glanced back toward the far end of town, where Farrell's house sat dark and silent. "Farrell will have your head for this," he said to the storekeeper. "Let him try." Another figure emerged from the shadows, Widow Pratt. Her shawl wrapped tight around her thin shoulders, her face hard as flint. She said nothing. She simply stood on Nora's other side, her arms folded, her gaze unwavering. The men looked at each other. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, the one with the lantern lowered it. He spat into the dirt. "This isn't over," he said. "Maybe not," the storekeeper said, "but it's over tonight." They left, the 3 of them, walking back the way they had come, their shapes swallowed by the dark. Nora let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Her legs felt weak, but she did not let herself sit. "Not yet." "Thank you," she said quietly. The storekeeper nodded. "Couldn't let them do it. Not like that." Widow Pratt adjusted her shawl. "Farrell's going to be angry." "Let him be angry," the storekeeper said. He looked at Nora. "You should get some sleep. I'll keep watch for a while." "I can. Sleep," he said again, more gently. "You've done enough for one night." Nora turned to the cage. Caleb stood pressed against the bars, his face pale in the dim light. His hands were shaking. She reached through and took one of his hands in both of hers. His skin was cold. "You're all right," she said. He nodded, but his voice when it came was unsteady. "You could have been hurt. You should have let them." "No." He closed his eyes. His hand tightened around hers. "Why?" he whispered. "Why are you doing this?" She did not answer right away. She held his hand and felt the pulse in his wrist, fast and fragile, and she thought about the question. She thought about Thomas and the porch and the grave she had dug. She thought about the house burning and the long walk west, and the moment she had knelt beside this cage and offered water to a stranger. "Because someone should," she said finally. "Because you're not alone, not anymore." His eyes opened. In the darkness, they were pale, almost colorless, but she saw the wetness in them, the grief and gratitude tangled together. He did not speak. He only held her hand, and she held his, and the night settled around them, quieter now. The storekeeper and Widow Pratt left after a while, drifting back to their own doors, their own lives. Nora stayed. She sat on the platform with her back against the bars, and Caleb sat on the other side, close enough that their shoulders almost touched through the iron. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant, and the wind carried the scent of dust and sage. "Tell me something," Caleb said after a long silence. "What?" "Anything. Just talk. I need to hear something other than my own thoughts." She thought for a moment. Then she said, "When I was a girl, my father used to take me to a creek near our house. It wasn't much, just a little stream that ran through the woods, but in the summer, it was cool and clear. He'd roll up his trousers and I'd take off my shoes, and we'd wade in and look for crawfish under the rocks. He'd tell me stories while we searched. Made up things about knights and dragons and princesses who saved themselves. I loved those stories. I loved that creek." "Do you ever go back?" "No. My father's gone. The creek probably dried up. Some things you can't go back to." "I know." They sat in the quiet. After a while, she felt his hand reach through the bars and rest on her shoulder, light as a bird. She did not pull away. She leaned back, just slightly, so the weight of her was against him. And his hand stayed where it was. "I'm glad you stopped here," he said. "So am I." When dawn came, soft and gray, she rose stiffly and walked to the well. She filled the canteen and brought it back, along with the last of the bread. She passed it through the bars and watched him eat. His hands were steadier now. His face, though still tired, had lost some of its fear. "What happens next?" he asked. "I don't know, but we'll figure it out." "We?" She smiled, just a little. "We." She left him then and went back to her room. She lay down on the narrow bed and closed her eyes, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Not happiness, not yet, but hope. Small and fragile, like the first green shoot pushing through winter ground. She held onto it, and she slept. The marshal arrived on the 7th day. He came alone, riding a tall bay horse, his badge catching the afternoon sun. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with a weathered face and gray hair cropped close beneath his hat. He dismounted in front of the general store and tied his horse to the rail, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose joints ached but whose purpose was clear. Nora was sitting on the platform when she saw him. Caleb was awake, standing against the bars, his hands resting on the iron. They had been talking quietly, about nothing and everything, the way they had learned to do. When the marshal appeared, they both fell silent. He walked across the square slowly, his boots raising small puffs of dust. His eyes took in the cage, the man inside it, and the woman sitting beside it. He stopped a few feet away and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." Nora nodded. "Marshal." He turned his attention to Caleb. "You Caleb Stern?" "I am. I'm Marshal Wade. Got word there was trouble here. A barn fire. You're accused of setting it." "I didn't." Wade's expression did not change. "That's what they all say." He looked around the square, at the buildings with their shuttered windows, at the empty street. "Where's Amos Farrell?" "His place is at the far end of town," Nora said. "Past the livery." Wade nodded. He looked at her for a moment, his gaze steady and measuring. "You got a stake in this?" "I do." "What kind?" "The kind that says a man shouldn't be locked in a cage without a fair hearing." Wade's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Fair enough." He turned back to Caleb. "I'll need to talk to Farrell, hear his side, then I'll decide what happens next." "And until then?" Caleb asked. "You stay where you are." Wade walked away, his stride unhurried, and disappeared around the corner. Nora stood and brushed the dust from her skirt. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands were steady. "What do you think he'll do?" Caleb asked. "I don't know, but he's here. That's something." She went to the store and bought cornmeal and a little sugar. The storekeeper was quiet, his face thoughtful. When she paid him, he leaned across the counter. "Wade's." "A fair man," he said. "If Stern's telling the truth, Wade will see it. And if Farrell convinces him otherwise." The storekeeper did not answer. He did not have to. Nora returned to the cage and made johnny cakes on a small fire she built in the square, using stones to hold the pan. Caleb watched her through the bars, and when the cakes were done, she passed them through, still warm. They ate together without speaking, and the silence was companionable, almost peaceful. The marshal returned as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. He walked with Amos Farrell at his side, and behind them came the storekeeper and Widow Pratt and a handful of others who had gathered, drawn by the presence of the law. Farrell's face was hard, his jaw set. Wade's was unreadable. They stopped in front of the cage. Wade hooked his thumbs in his belt and looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the square. "I've heard Farrell's side. Now I'll hear yours. Tell me what happened the night of the fire." Caleb straightened. His voice was calm, clear. "I was walking back from the creek. I'd been washing my clothes. I saw smoke and went to see where it was coming from. By the time I got to the barn, it was already burning. The doors were open, and I could hear the horses inside, panicking. I went in and led 2 of them out. I tried to go back for the 3rd, but the smoke was too thick. That's when Farrell found me. And the kerosene smell? The barn reeked of it. I was covered in smoke and ash. That's what he smelled." Wade nodded slowly. He turned to Farrell. "You said you saw him standing near the barn before the fire started." "I did," Farrell said. "He was lurking around. I thought it was strange, but I didn't say anything. Then an hour later, my barn's in flames." "Did you see him light the fire?" Farrell hesitated. "No. But who else would have done it?" "That's not evidence," Wade said. "That's suspicion." Farrell's face darkened. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm saying what you saw isn't proof. You saw a man near your barn. You saw your barn burn. That doesn't mean the first caused the second. Then who did?" Wade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have any enemies, Farrell? Anyone who'd want to hurt you?" Farrell's jaw worked. He looked away, his eyes scanning the watching crowd. "I got competitors, men who don't like that I own the best land around here. But I don't know that any of them would burn my barn. But it's possible." Farrell said nothing. Wade turned back to Caleb. "You got anyone who can vouch for you? Anyone who saw you at the creek that night?" Caleb shook his head. "No, I was alone." Wade sighed. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, then put it back on. "Here's what I see. I see a man accused of a crime with no solid evidence. I see another man who lost his barn and wants someone to blame. And I see a town that's ready to hang a stranger because it's easier than admitting they don't know who's really responsible." "So you're letting him go?" Farrell's voice was tight with anger. "I'm saying there's not enough to hold him. If you get real evidence, you bring it to me. Until then, he walks." Farrell stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "That's not justice. That's the law," Wade said. His voice was hard now, brooking no argument. "You don't like it. Take it up with the judge next time he comes through. But I'm not letting you hang a man on a hunch." He pulled a key from his pocket and walked to the cage. He unlocked the door and swung it open. The hinges creaked, loud in the sudden silence. Caleb stood frozen for a moment, as if he did not believe what was happening. Then he stepped out, his legs unsteady, his hand gripping the edge of the door for support. Nora moved to his side. She took his arm, steadying him. He looked at her, his eyes wide, and she saw the disbelief and relief tangled together in his face. "Thank you," he said to Wade. Wade nodded. "Don't make me regret it. And don't stay in this town longer than you have to. Farrell's got friends, and they don't all care about the law." Caleb nodded. Farrell turned and walked away, his back stiff, his boots heavy. The crowd began to disperse, drifting back to their lives. Their voices low and uncertain. The storekeeper caught Nora's eye and nodded once before disappearing into his shop. Widow Pratt lingered for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then she too left. Wade mounted his horse. He looked down at Nora and Caleb, standing together in the fading light. "You've got courage, man," he said. "Both of you. But courage doesn't stop a bullet. Be careful." He turned the horse and rode out of town, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Nora and Caleb stood alone in the square. The cage loomed behind them, empty now, a dark shape against the sky. "What do we do now?" "Ow?" Caleb asked. Nora looked at him. His face was thinner than it had been a week ago, his eyes shadowed. But there was something new in them too, something like hope. "We leave," she said. "Tonight, before Farrell changes his mind. Where will we go? She thought of the roads stretching west, the flat land and the open sky. She thought of the little pouch in her pocket, the ring inside it, and the wooden horse Caleb had carved for his son. She thought of the porch she would never sit on again, and the grave she had left behind, and the long walk that had brought her here. Somewhere new, she said, somewhere we can start over. He nodded slowly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden horse. He held it in his palm, looking at it for a long moment. Then he pressed it into her hand. For you, he said, so you remember. She closed her fingers around it. The wood was warm and smooth. She reached into her coat and pulled out the leather pouch. She opened it and took out the ring. She held it up, the gold catching the last light of the day. For you, she said, so you remember too. He took it, his hand trembling slightly. He slipped it onto his smallest finger, where it fit snugly. They stood looking at each other, two broken people made whole by each other's presence. Then, without a word, they turned and walked together toward the edge of town, toward the road that led west, toward whatever came next. They walked through the night and into the next day, following the road west until it became little more than a suggestion in the grass. The land opened before them, wide and empty, the sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. They did not speak much. There was no need. The silence between them had become a language of its own, shaped by trust and something deeper, something neither of them had words for yet. On the second day they found a creek, narrow but clear, with cottonwoods growing along its banks. They stopped there to rest and drink. Caleb knelt at the water's edge and splashed his face, and Nora sat in the shade and watched the light move through the leaves. It reminded her of the creek her father had taken her to, long ago, and she felt a pang of something that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but somewhere in between. We could stay here for a while, Caleb said, sitting back on his heels. Rest, figure out where we're going. Nora looked at the cottonwoods, at the way their roots held the bank steady, at the small cleared space beneath them where the ground was soft and level. She thought of all the miles behind them and all the miles still ahead, and she realized she was tired, not just in her body, but in her bones, in her soul, tired of walking away. Yes, she said, let's stay. They built a camp there, simple and spare. Caleb gathered stones and made a fire ring, and Nora spread the blanket beneath the largest tree. They had little, a few supplies bought from the storekeeper before they left, the canteen, the tin cup, the clothes on their backs, but it was enough, more than enough. The days passed quietly. Caleb carved while Nora mended or walked along the creek, watching the water. He made small things at first, a spoon, a bowl, his hands remembering skills they had not used in years. Then he began to carve something larger, a figure taking shape slowly from a piece of driftwood he had found half buried in the sand. Nora did not ask what it was. She only watched his hands move, patient and sure, and felt something settle in her chest. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned cool, he showed her what he had made. It was a woman, small enough to fit in his palm, her arms outstretched, her face turned toward the sky. The detail was fine, delicate, each line carved with care. It's you, he said quietly. She took it and turned it in her hands. She could see herself in it, or perhaps the self she was becoming, no longer hunched under the weight of loss, but standing upright, reaching. She felt her throat tighten. It's beautiful, she said. You're beautiful. She looked up at him. His gray eyes were steady, clear, and in them she saw everything he had not said, everything she had not said either. She set the carving down carefully and reached for his hand. He took it, his fingers warm and strong, and they sat together as the light faded and the stars began to appear, one by one, cold and eternal. I was thinking, he said after a while, that maybe we don't need to keep running. Maybe we've run far enough. What are you saying? I'm saying we could build something here, a cabin, maybe. Something small but ours. Plant a garden, stay. She looked at the creek, at the cottonwoods, at the wide sky above them. She thought of the house she had burned and the grave she had dug, and the long walk that had brought her to a cage in a dusty town. She thought aught of Caleb's hand in hers, steady and warm, and the way the silence between them had become a kind of home. "Yes," she said, "let's stay." They worked through the spring and into the summer, building a cabin from logs they cut and dragged from the creek bed. It was slow work, hard work, but it was good. They learned each other's rhythms, the way Caleb measured twice before cutting, the way Nora hummed softly when she was concentrating. They learned to move around each other without words, passing tools, steadying beams, their bodies speaking a language older than speech. By autumn, the cabin stood, small and sturdy, with a door that latched and a roof that did not leak. They built a porch on the south side, wide enough for 2 chairs, and in the evenings they sat there and watched the sun set over the plains. Sometimes Caleb whittled, his hands never still, and sometimes Nora read aloud from a book the storekeeper had given her when they left, the pages worn but the words still clear. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, content. They did not speak vows. There was no preacher, no witness, no ring exchanged except the one Caleb still wore on his smallest finger. But one night, as they lay on the blanket beneath the cottonwoods, Nora took a strand of her hair and a strand of his and braided them together. Binding them with a piece of thread, she tied the braid around her wrist and he covered it with his hand, and that was enough. More than enough. Winter came, cold and hard, but the cabin held. They kept the fire burning and the shelves stocked with preserves and dried meat. They told each other stories, fragments of the lives they had lived before, piecing together the past without letting it consume them. Caleb spoke of his son, and the words no longer broke him. Nora spoke of Thomas, and the grief no longer drowned her. They carried their losses together, and in the carrying, the weight grew lighter. Spring returned, and with it, new life. They planted a garden, rows of beans and squash and corn. They tended it together, their hands in the soil, and when the first green shoots appeared, Nora wept. Caleb held her, and she held him, and they stood in the garden they had made and felt something like grace. Years passed. The cabin weathered and settled into the land, its wood graying, its porch worn smooth by their feet. Travelers sometimes passed and stopped for water or a meal, and Nora and Caleb welcomed them, offering what they had without question. Some of the travelers spoke of a town called Vardy, far to the east, and of a man named Farrell, whose barn had burned and who had never found the one responsible. Some said the town had grown, others that it had withered. Nora and Caleb listened but did not ask for details. That life was behind them now, a story someone else had lived. One autumn evening, as the light turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and sage, Nora sat on the porch and looked out over the land. Caleb was beside her, his hands still, his face peaceful. They were older now, their hair streaked with silver, their bodies marked by the years, but they were here, together. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "stopping here instead of keeping on?" He thought for a moment, then he shook his head. "No, this is where I was supposed to be, where we were supposed to be." She nodded. She reached for his hand, and he took it, and they sat in the quiet as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to wheel overhead. The land remembers. It remembers the footsteps of those who walked away and those who stayed. It remembers the fires that burned and the crops that grew, the grief carried and the hope discovered. And in a place where a creek runs clear beneath cottonwoods, where a small cabin stands against the wind, the land remembers 2 people who found each other in the midst of loss and built a life from the broken pieces. Some say you can still see smoke rising from that place, thin and steady, a sign that the fire has not gone out. Some say if you stop there, you will find a porch worn smooth and a garden gone to seed. And carved into the doorframe, 2 names intertwined. Others say it is only a story, a legend told by travelers who need to believe that broken things can be made whole. But the land knows, the land remembers, and on quiet evenings, when the wind carries the scent of sage and the stars hang low, you can almost hear it, the sound of 2 voices, speaking softly, weaving silence into something like a song. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not an answer, but a question the heart knows how to answer. What does it mean to be home? Perhaps it is not a place you inherit, but a place you choose. Not a destination you reach, but a person you walk beside. Not a task you forget, but a future you build, one small act of courage at a time. The land holds its breath, and in the holding, it remembers.